Hey, I'm Felissa Rose, and you're watching Keto and Crime.
Columbine, y'all. The 1999 school shooting that basically set off the modern era of school shootings. We've seen them yearly, monthly, weekly. It was a terrible tragedy, and I remember what I was doing when this kicked off. I was working a job. Um, I used to work for in advertising for my local hometown newspaper. I was at work when this happened and had just gone on lunch and remember sitting in the rest. It was a Pizza Hut. I remember it to this day. I was sitting there, but of course my butt was eating pizza. I was sitting there eating it, watching the television in the little banquet room they had there, and the coverage came on. And I just remember welling up into tears when it happened. Um, this was a rough era for us all, and with all the stories of both heroes and villains that came out of this story, I thought it deserves some revisiting. In 2019, 2020, I did a two-parter on Columbine. I read several books, delved deep into news archives, and pulled out as much information on the shooters and most especially the victims that I could. I put together that two-parter, but I'm going to leave it available for you. I'll link it above if you want to watch this in more digestible pieces. But I'm also going to link it together in a lengthy documentary style video for you here. And with that being said, let's delve into one of the worst tragedies to ever befall the United States, the Columbine shooting, on Keto and Crime Classic.
Pretty heavy topic. Columbine. Yeah, this one's going to be rough. This one's going to be hard because not only was this a tragedy to end all tragedies, it was the granddaddy of all mass, especially school shootings that we've had since 1999. A lot of copycats copy this one, sadly. And this was also, a lot of people don't realize, this was also a copycat. So we're going to get into that. And I know I kind of look good. I need a haircut. There's nothing I can do for my hair that will not escape the fact your girl needs a haircut. So I apologize. I'm just going to end up having to cut it myself or get my wife to cut it. But this is the reality of quarantine. So I hope you enjoy it.
Look at her hair. My God, do you need money to get it cut?
I mean, not this, but I hope you enjoy the video. Let's get into it. So, Columbine. An unincorporated area a few miles west of the Denver suburb of Littleton, Colorado. And a lot of people say that Columbine was in Littleton. It may be now, but at the time, it was an unincorporated area. It really wasn't part of Littleton. It was just a few miles west of Denver. So people often say Littleton. Technically not correct. Just thought I would bring that up. Like I said, could possibly be part of Littleton now, but then it wasn't. It was in an area of Colorado known as Jefferson County. The area went through quite a transformation in the 90s. It started out as what I'd like to call old Columbine versus new Columbine. Basically, in the 70s, 80s, early 90s, a lot of what I would call country people. Houses spread far out, a mixture of people. Let's just call it, for the sake of argument, redneck Columbine versus new Columbine. In the mid-90s, you had an influx of jobs in the way of defense contractors like Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, as well as you already had a huge presence of the United States military there. NORAD is in Colorado, in the Rockies. You had the Air Force Academy not far away from this area in Colorado Springs. So you had a huge influx of military personnel as well as defense contractor personnel. And with defense contractors comes high pay. So you had a lot of new suburbs springing up, brand new designer homes, developers coming in and buying out a whole range of property and basically installing homes that look pretty much the same but are really high end. So that's the model that we're going to start with just before this happened in 1999. You had the old country folks starting to be kind of pressed out or having to assimilate with the new upper middle class that was descending on the area. And you had a lot of the same types of people there. You had people that knew each other, because think about it. Boeing alone employed about 1,800 people in the area. So that's a lot of families. So you had a lot of people that had similar interests, and with them came what I like to call a new revolution in religion. The area before was just a lot of mainstream Protestant religions. You had, your Episcopalians, your Methodists, your, basically what we know as Baptists that are outside the Southern Baptist Convention, just your basic midline Protestants dominated the area, and a lot of Catholics too. And then with this new wave of people coming in from other countries, you had an insurgence of evangelical Protestants. Now, these are the ones you see on television with the huge mega churches and the camp meetings, and the ones that actively try to pull you into their religion, whereas, you got your mainline people over here that, they kind of demonstrate their faith, but they don't really try to bring people in all that much. But evangelicals really take Christ's commission to, the ultimate. So they built a lot of mega churches in the area. Trinity Christian Center, which basically took place at Columbine High School and in a community center near there. And you also had West Bowles Community Church, not far from Columbine. These were your typical, think any number of Christian movies you've seen where you've seen a mega church. That's what you had there. And so as a result, you had the Catholics and the mainline Protestants kind of having to mingle with these evangelical Christians that had clubs at school, that started student-ran clubs, that walked around with remember the What Would Jesus Do bracelets? You had a lot of that there. Demographically, it was a majority white area. You did have a few African Americans, Latino, and Native Americans in the area, but for the most part, it was white. And the only reason I'm telling you this is because demographics play a huge role in the massacre as we get close to it. And as a result, it wasn't all bad. Early Columbine High School was a kind of a makeshift school. It had temporary walls. It had, pull-out accordion walls that could be pulled out into larger rooms to make smaller classrooms. So it was one level. So you had, kind of a country school. And then with all the new, more affluent people moving in, with all the new influx, you had a complete rebuild of the school. It went from a one-story schoolhouse with temporary walls to a brand new structure with a second story, brand new state-of-the-art library above what would become the most important part of the school just because of its communal area. You had the cafeteria, and then outside you had the walls of the school kind of coming out into a design of different sidewalks known as the commons. And that's where a lot of what we're going to talk about today takes place. So you had a whole new school built. You had a new resurgence of the football team, which was known as the Rebels. And you also had a bigger divide between New Columbine and Old Columbine. There were still some leftovers of that rough country that you had seen there. Some of the teachers were from Old Columbine and that they had been at the school for years. Among them, Coach Dave Sanders, who would be one of the heroes to come out of this tragedy, even though he lost his life. He would be known as one of the heroes. He coached 7 sports at the school. He took the girls' basketball team from an absolute slump to a state championship. A very well-loved teacher, but he was definitely Old Columbine. And he was quoted in the definitive book on this subject as saying that you could tell who was Old Columbine versus New Columbine by who showed up at the Columbine Lounge on Friday nights, and this was just your tough honky-tonk redneck sort of bar, and it was a place that he frequented, and you could tell who was kind of redneck versus who was upper middle class yuppie, for lack of a better term, even though the term yuppie went out with the 80s. But that's the area that we're going into. For the most part, this was America. This was mid-America. This was a place that everyone thought would remain untouched by tragedy, just because of the sparseness of the population. I mean, Colorado is today one of the top 10 fastest growing states, but that wasn't true in the 90s. In fact, you have that whole western area, Colorado, Nevada, Utah, the North Dakota, they're all like in the top 10 fastest growing states, mostly because people are leaving California and Washington, which are becoming overcrowded. And so you see a huge influx of population now, but then sparsely populated. So everybody thought very little chance of anything bad happening there. Occasionally you would get your crazy anti-government, person like the Unabomber or Timothy McVeigh, camping out in his own land somewhere in the Rockies or somewhere in the woods, but they really wouldn't hurt anybody. At least there, they would go elsewhere to do their crime. So that was just kind of the area that we lived in. It was into this area that the subjects of our video were born into and migrated into. Let's get into it, shall we? Let's talk about our two perpetrators. Eric David Harris. Born April 9th, 1981 in Wichita, Kansas. His father, Wayne, had advanced to the rank of major in the United States Air Force. He was a pilot. His mom, Catherine, was a homemaker, as a lot of military brides tend to be because you move around so often. He had an older brother named Kevin. And he was always kind of a shy kid. In fact, he was so far under the shadow of his brother that when he played Little League, he played Pee Wee football, he played all kinds of stuff as a kid, mostly because of pressure put on him by his father. But he had a hard time making friends because they moved so often. In Eric's young life, they lived in a total of about 11 different towns near 6 different military bases, spanning the areas of Kansas, Ohio, Michigan, New York, and then finally into Colorado. And you got to imagine, if you ever talk to a military child, they will tell you that the moving around is one of the hardest things. It affected Eric a lot. He had a hard time making friends, and he became painfully shy because he felt he couldn't live up to both his father's unique standards being a military officer and his older brother Kevin, which just seemed to excel at everything. And like I said, he played Little League sports, but his Little League coach was quoted as saying he wouldn't even swing at the ball during games because it wasn't because he was afraid of the ball. It was because he was afraid of missing the ball. And it took a lot of coaching and cajoling from his friends, from his teammates to actually get him to swing at the ball. That's how introverted this young man was. He did have some interests, though. He loved fireworks. He loved loud noises. He loved guns. He loved bombs. And he was kind of a pyromaniac. As a child, he loved to play with matches. His parents had to watch him quite a bit. And then as he grew, Eric was never really ever exposed to a lot of close-knit people. In fact, Wichita, Kansas was the largest city he ever lived in. If that tells you, then Wichita's not that big. I know I've done comedy there. I'm sure it was even smaller in the 90s. So his life was his family and his immediate acquaintances. And as I said, he loved fireworks, and then he got into more mainstream activities like video games and computers. As I said, he was very quiet and was afraid of failing. He did okay in school, but never really put forth any aspirations of being anything. as far as being a specific vocation. And then on the flip side, you had Dylan Bennett Klebold. He was born September 11th, 1981, to Thomas and Susan Klebold. Thomas was an engineer in the oil industry. He was also a very successful real estate developer, buying and flipping properties, as well as renting them out. His mom, Susan, was a special education teacher. He also had an older brother by the name of Byron. Whereas Eric's family was of the traditional evangelical type of religion, Dylan had a mixed family. He was raised Lutheran. His father was a Lutheran. His mother practiced Lutheranism, but she was actually from a very close-knit Jewish family. And she introduced both Byron and Dylan to the Jewish religion growing up. So they kind of had a good understanding of both. And this would lead to a little bit of tension between him and Eric later on, which we'll get into. He was a very polite child, a good child, didn't really get into trouble. Susan doted on both of her boys. Both of the Klebolds were pacifists. They didn't believe in violence, they didn't like guns, and they raised their children to be the same. Unlike Eric's father, who was military, raised both of his children hunting as well as shooting, and and then having sons interested in things like fire and video games and things like that. So it's a very different atmosphere for the two children. Now wait, before you say I'm getting on, I'm not wanting to get into a gun control debate. Gun control is a part of this that we will talk about at the end, but I believe in the Second Amendment. I also really believe in responsible gun ownership. And do I believe that just because Eric was raised in a military family, that's the reason this happened? No, I don't. I'm just telling you the contrast between the two boys. So just wanted to put that out there. Like Eric, Dylan played sports. He was in the T-ball league. Then he graduated up to Little League baseball and soccer. He was also a Cub Scout. And he developed his very first close friendship with in the first grade with his friend Brooks Brown, who will play a very important part in this as well. And they lived near each other. They hung out all the time. And it would later be Dylan that introduced Eric to Brooks, and they would develop kind of a friendship. It was a little weird, but we'll get into that. He grew up near the Columbine area, and it was in 1996 that they actually moved into the neighborhood that he was living in when the whole incident went down. So it was also about this time that the Harrises left New York and moved to Colorado for two reasons: because budget cuts and cutbacks during the peacetime of the 90s. The military was downsizing. The military was not immune to monetary problems and fiscal problems, and they were downsizing. And as a result, a lot of officers and longtime enlisted men were forced into retirement, and Wayne Harris was one of them. So he was forced into retirement, and he took a job with one of the defense contractors in Colorado and brought his family in 1996 to the Columbine area. About the same time as when the Klebolds left Littleton proper and moved further out to Columbine. Both became fast friends, along with Brooks Brown and Eric's friend, Nathan Dykeman. They became a very close-knit group of four and were friends all the way through elementary and into high school. It's here that I would like to say that they all lived happily ever after, but we know that that's not the truth. Dylan and Eric were a bad influence on each other, and both Nathan and Brooks, even though they went along with a lot of their angst, really saw that the two were not good for each other. Brooks later on would say these things in a post-Columbine interview, but they got each other into a lot of trouble. Eric, because he was always kind of a pacifist and kind of demure, he would follow along with whatever Eric said. And so Eric would bring him into his playing with fire and fireworks and shooting guns and things like that, though Dylan had to keep all that stuff secret from his parents because his parents were pacifists. They would not let him play with any of those things. So it was kind of secret. Dylan was also, as far back as 9th grade, suffering from depression. This would be evident in the journals and diaries found after his death in 1999, but he was a very depressed young man. Chronic depression is a killer. It really is, and it definitely was in this case. And he wrote a lot in his journals about suicide, grotesque pictures of death, and weapons. He had his own fixation with weapons. But it was more about generalized harm and harming himself rather than harming others was the big difference between he and Eric. Eric wrote about the same sort of things, except all of his were directed at other people. The boys at Columbine, the 4 boys, Nathan, Brooks, Eric, and Dylan, were bullied. They were definitely bullied by the more popular kids at school. Columbine was not immune to cliques. I was bullied in high school. I didn't really have a clique. I was kind of a loner. These 4 were kind of loners. They were, to quote some of the people that have studied the case, they were kind of the losers of the losers, as bad as that sounds. They were the outcasts from the outcasts. They didn't even fit in with the geek squad for as much. They just kind of hung out on their own. They were accused of being part of a club known as the Trenchcoat Mafia. That was not true. We will go into that a little bit when we get to the end of the case about theories. But they were not part of the Trenchcoat Mafia. And they were just kind of loners that concentrated on their schoolwork and kind of kept to themselves. They had other interests, which we'll get into. But as a result of being bullied, Eric started to show aggressiveness in his writings. His journals, after they were found, showed a lot of interest in hurting others, as well as his fascination with Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, as well as the KKK. He wrote about genocide and killing. He was definitely on his way to being a white supremacist. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. So Eric had a lot of problems. And as a result, young, depressive, impressionable Dylan kind of followed along because this was his best friend. And he didn't want to lose him. So he was a strong personality that he kind of followed on, much like his parents that kind of led him down the road to their beliefs. Here was Eric leading him down the road to his beliefs, and Dylan lapped it up. There were a lot of warning signs way before April 20th, 1999, that showed that these boys had a lot of issues. Going all the way back as far as freshman year with fights and all of their classwork assignments, homework, they wrote about grotesque things. I mean, I know kids can be, as a kid, I wrote about grotesque things. I loved horror films as a kid. I would write about some of that stuff, but so I understand why maybe all of this stuff didn't raise a whole lot of, eyebrows with the teachers, because it is kind of typical for kids to be into gross things. But they took it way too far, and they started to act out on some of this stuff by the time they were juniors and seniors. As early as 1998, there were a lot of warnings. One, a specific incident with a young lady named Tiffany Teifer, who was in Eric's German class. Eric wanted to be a ladies' man. I've heard a lot of accounts that he died a virgin. I've also heard accounts that he lost his virginity to a 23-year-old at the age of 17. So, and that he was kind of a ladies' man. He had no problem getting girls. So I've heard both sides. What's true? Probably somewhere in the middle. I think he probably did get some girls, but probably not a womanizer. But he did tend to attach himself onto certain women. He would get a fixation on certain girls, and those were his main focus of all his attention. And Tiffany was one of those. They had become acquainted in German class. She was friendly to him. They talked. He tried to ask her out. He asked her to homecoming specifically. She did go with him. But then after homecoming, she kind of lost interest. He took homecoming as an indication that they were now a couple. She didn't see it that way. And when she went on with her life and started socializing with other boys, Eric kind of snapped. But instead of hurting her or hurting anyone else, he faked suicide. One day it's after school on the Commons area. He splashed himself with fake blood, pretended to shoot himself, and collapsed on the ground in front of Tiffany. She ran over, of course, to see if he was okay. When he woke up and told her that it was just a joke, and everybody, and he and Dylan and Brooks and Nathan started laughing, she became incensed. She got up, she yelled at him, as anyone would, got up and yelled at him saying, "You need to seek some help," and walked away, never spoke to him again. If only he would have sought that help. Along this time, Dylan and Eric started, this was 98, November, December of 1998, they started dressing in all black, including combat boots, wearing black trench coats, some, even though they weren't part of that specific group of kids or club that wore them, the mafia, so to speak. They started wearing those dark clothes, dark glasses, and it was then that Susan Klebold started noticing a change at home in her son. He was a lot more repressed. He kind of went into himself. He spent a lot more time in his room. He really wouldn't talk to her. She would take him out to try to, have a nice evening with him, take him out to dinner, he would wear the black trench coat, the dark glasses, and just have this sullen look. Now, Dylan was not a small person. Dylan was over 6 foot tall. He was very tall, lanky. He was kind of a menacing character. He could be, especially in a trench coat and dark glasses. And there was an incident in a restaurant out in Littleton where they went that he wore the black trench coat and the dark glasses inside the restaurant. And Susan said she noticed out of the corner of her eye that people were uncomfortable. They were staring at him. They were moving purposely away. It was obvious that they were just very uncomfortable with his appearance, and she actually mentioned it to him and said, "Dylan, why don't you take off the coat and glasses? You're scaring people." And Dylan just smiled at her. Never took off the glasses, never took off the coat. And she says later on in interviews that she wished she had taken control of the situation and made him, but she just thought he was going through a phase, as a lot of parents often do, especially given that Eric had already gotten Dylan arrested once. In January of 1998, Eric and Dylan were arrested for breaking into a computer store van parked in Littleton, stealing tools and computer equipment. They were basically arrested and given a joint court hearing where they pled guilty. It was considered felony theft. And they were sentenced to a juvenile diversion program, which included anger management and probation and community service that would later be expunged from their records. And Susan says at that point she wishes she had severed all contact between Dylan and Eric, as well as kind of taken control of her son. But again, I guess all sometimes parents just don't know what to do. Not all parents are perfect, So there was that hanging over their head, as well as the fact it made her really nervous that Eric's parents, especially Wayne, seemed to kind of justify what their son did. Oh, it's boys. He had a boys will be boys kind of attitude. Catherine seemed to kind of cower in the gaze of her husband, so she didn't really say anything. So you basically had Eric's father defending all of his actions, saying it's boys will be boys. I got into trouble as a kid. I turned out okay kind of attitude. And Susan said that made her and Thomas really uncomfortable. And they said, looking back, they wish they had severed ties between the two boys. Getting deeper into 1998, probably the most intricate thing that happened, as I said, Brooks Brown, who was Dylan's friend from childhood, had gotten to know Eric, and they had been kind of a foursome of friends. One morning, Brooks volunteered to pick Eric up for school. He drove to get him. He was late, and he did not call. By the time he got there, Eric was so incensed that he picked up a chunk of ice and threw it at Dylan's car, smashing his window. Brooks immediately called his mom. His mom immediately came over. They did call the police and report it to the police. And the police basically released him into his father's care. And Eric was forced by Wayne to apologize to Brooks. And it was at that point that Wayne Harris allegedly started keeping a notebook of everything that Eric had done, simply titled Eric. And again, it was a boys will be boys kind of thing. I can't even imagine what might have gone on in that house, but that seems really strange. Eric had a basement bedroom in the house, and he was pretty much had his privacy. And it was there that he kind of indulged his violent behavior by looking up things like the Anarchist Cookbook, reading about Hitler, reading about the KKK, honing everything hateful that he could. He wasn't a very ominous looking boy. He was about 5'9", so he was average. But he was much shorter than Dylan, but seemed to have little man syndrome, is the only way I can attest, and he kind of controlled Dylan with his little man syndrome kind of thing. And it wasn't long after that Eric got himself back into trouble by setting fires in the neighborhood and going from house to house, filling locks with glue. Little juvenile delinquent Eric. Should have been thrown under the jail by now, but again, his military, now defense contractor father, got him off without any punishment. And again, boys will be boys. Do you see why that attitude can sometimes be toxic? Because you had a guy here that was willing just to bury his head into the sand and really believe that anything a boy did was just boys will be boys. I can get behind boys will be boys if they get out and scrape their knees and get dirty and bring home bring home lizards and turtles and things like. I get that. That is boys will be boys. I get that. That's even some girls be girls. But vandalism isn't boys will be boys. That's boys need their ass whooped, is what that means. So anyway, it was just bizarre. The more I dug into this, it was just like, wow. And it was in early 1999 that Eric, Dylan, and two other boys, not Nathan or Brooks, decided to get even with some students and broke into the Columbine computer system and tried to change students' grades. And again, Mr. Harris took Eric's side, whereas Susan and Thomas grounded Dylan, tried to keep him from seeing Eric, but it didn't really work. So these were some very heavy warning signs that were going down long before. Also, both boys began to escalate what they were writing in their diaries. They started writing more and more about grotesque things in their diaries as well as in their schoolwork. Again, people made note of it, but nobody really did anything about it. They started spending more and more time shooting and learning to shoot. They were also young filmmakers. They were in a video production class, so they spent a lot of time together with Brooks and Nathan and some other people doing Tarantino-like videos, as well as what has come to be known as the basement tapes, which only part of them have ever been released, but these are the tapes kind of outlining their manifesto, and also as well as saying goodbye to their families about 30 minutes before the incident went down. Most astute, right before spring, this was, late winter of 1999, Harris actually wrote in an old yearbook that he wanted to, and a journal, that he wanted to kill Brooks Brown. He felt that Brooks's fault he had a criminal record, kind of ignoring all the other incidents that he had done that Brooks had nothing to do with. And Dylan also wrote in Harris's yearbook that he wanted to blow stuff up and kill cops. So things were getting really, really dark for Eric and Dylan. It is alleged that in one of the basement tapes, a few of them have been released, but not all of them, that in one of these basement tapes where they just turn on the video camera inside Eric's basement room and just talk about their anger and their need for revenge, In one of these, Dylan actually mentions that he's Jewish. And Eric's demeanor changes. He says, "What do you mean you're Jewish?" And he goes, "Yeah, I'm half Jewish." And it was almost as if their demeanors flipped. Eric seemed very angry, whereas Dylan then seemed more fearful of Eric. And then Eric simply said, "Well, I guess you can't help everything, can you?" And it kind of went on. But it was obvious that Eric didn't like the fact that his best friend was part Jewish. So Eric was a hate ball. He was full of hate. Dylan was depressed, I think, and had a lot of rage toward people that maybe he perceived had hurt him, or just against the world in general, because he was depressed. And it would later come out as by Dr. Dwayne Fuselier, who was the FBI agent that investigated this incident, as well as he was a criminal psychologist. He would actually come out and say that it was obvious from Eric's writings and the videos that he observed, the ones that weren't, makeshift movies, that Eric was your stereotypical psychopath, and Dylan was heavily depressed. And you had somebody that was a psychopath with homicidal tendencies meeting somebody that was depressed with suicidal tendencies, coming together in a perfect storm of evil. And he said that's kind of what happened here. And now I want to take you through the few days prior to the shooting. This is going to be rough. So let me give you an indication of what their life was like. I think it'll shock you. I really do, because it wasn't as unusual as you might think. They did some typical high school things. Let's get into it. For about a year, the boys had worked at the local Columbine/Littleton location of Blackjack Pizza. This particular franchise was owned by Robert Kurgis. Kurgis was 29 years old, but he was kind of a young at heart. So he hung out with his employees. After they closed, they would go up to the roof every night. They would shoot off fireworks. They would drink beer and just generally shoot the shit. Talk about girls, talk about everything. So they both loved their jobs. Eric excelled at the job. In fact, he was basically functioned as an assistant manager. He made more money than Dylan. Eric made just over $7 an hour, where Dylan made just over $6. In fact, Dylan had been fired several times from the pizza place, and Eric had helped him get his job back. It was also here, through another co-worker named Philip Duran, that they met drug dealer Mark Maines, who would be the one to help them secure some of the weapons they used. Because they were underage, they really could, because of their convictions of early, they couldn't really buy guns. So Mark would supply them with the Tech 9s, the Tech 9 semi-automatic weapons that is often seen on some of the video footage you may have seen. He would help them secure those through his connections, being a drug dealer. And it was Philip that would introduce him to Mark, and Mark would help him get the Tech 9s as well as the ammunition to go with them. And it was through their connections at work that happened. Also, it was getting close to prom time. We're in April of 1999, and it's prom time. Dylan already has a date, and Eric can't believe it. Dylan will be going with Robin Anderson, who is a contender for school valedictorian, as well as a very active church member of the Trinity Christian Center that we mentioned earlier when we were talking about the mega churches. She was very definitely an evangelical Christian. She wore her "What Would Jesus Do" bracelet proudly, and she was the picture of a good church girl. She also helped them get the shotguns that they would use during the killing. Again, because of age and their former convictions, previous convictions, they couldn't just go and buy a gun. So Robin accompanied them to gun shows and helped them buy the shotguns they would use during this. Dylan told Robin they wanted to hunt and target practice, and also wanted to use them for some of their videos because they made those, remember, Quentin Tarantino type movies. They actually made those movies under their nicknames. Eric's was Rebel, after the Rebel sports teams at Columbine High School, and Dylan's was Vodka because he liked to drink vodka. And so they would make these very Tarantino-like movies. And she honestly believed that's why they want him. She was head over heels for Dylan. Even though he didn't really like her that way, she was head over heels for him. And there was nothing he couldn't have asked her that she wouldn't have done. So she went with them to the gun shows and helped them get the shotguns. And, of course, the ammo as well. At this time, both Dylan and Eric were playing soccer. They seemed to like it. They seemed to love their classes, especially their video production classes. And were into making their movies. Only two of them have ever been released for public viewing. Hitman for Hire and Rampage. And Dylan excelled as an actor. It's just like he was always so quiet and unassuming that in real life, when he got in front of the camera, he let all of perhaps his passion and his anger and everything come out. So he was a really good actor. And I'll insert a couple of clips here. Yeah.
Okay, just keep recording so I can...
Oh, George, go off me with a pretty colder.
No, you goddamn piece of punk ass shit! Do not mess with that friggin' kid! If you do, I will rip off your goddamn head and shove it so far up your friggin' ass, you'll be coughing up dandruff for 4 friggin' months!
Look, I don't care what you say. If you ever touch him again, I will frickin' kill you. I'm gonna pull out a goddamn shotgun and blow your damn head off. Do you understand, you little worthless piece of crap?
Also, in addition to their video production class, they were also taking a bowling elective, which meant they had to be at the local bowling center at 6 a.m. If you saw the Michael Moore documentary, Bowling for Columbine, that's what the title referred to as the bowling elective both boys took. As I said earlier, a lot of cliques at the school. They were subject to bullying from athletes, and as a result, they had both developed that explosive temper, which very definitely came out in their movies. Eric, much to the dismay of his parents by this time, had no college plans whatsoever. He said he wanted to be a Marine just to please his father and get his father Wayne off his back, and said he was going to speak to a Marine recruiter before graduation. Dylan, however, had very different plans. Dylan wanted to be a computer engineer. He had already chosen his college, the University of Arizona, and was planning to enroll there in the fall of the next year. So Dylan had a lot to look forward to and was going along as if life was going to go on. But unbeknownst to this happy veneer that he had put on, he and Eric had been planning this murder, this rampage, for over a year. And every bit of their planning materials, videos, journals, detailed timelines were left for the police to find. They both knew it was going to end in their deaths, so they both knew they wouldn't be seeing graduation, either of them. But yet Dylan went on with his life, planning and seeming excited about it. He was excited about going to the prom with Robin. Eric, because he considered it kind of uncool to go to a prom without a date, was trying to find a date. And he had developed a fixation for a young woman named Susan who worked at the Great Clips hair salon in the same strip mall as Blackjack Pizza, and started striking up conversations with her. He got her number. He called her mother or her home one night to speak to her, to actually ask her to prom. And her mother said she wasn't there. She was visiting a friend. Eric got so upset, he started raising his voice to her mother. The mother, who I would have hung up if I had been her, was just so shocked, she actually ended up giving Eric Susan's beeper number, old-fashioned pagers, for those of you that were born after that. And he paged Susan. She called him back. They talked, and she accepted Eric's invitation to prom, which was going to take place April 17th. 1999. Also, the week of the prom, a sale of Blackjack Pizza was finalized and Robert no longer owned it. The new owner fired almost all the employees except for Eric and Dylan and cut off their rooftop fireworks shooting and beer drinking, so that wasn't a thing. But the week of the prom, they both went to the new owner of Blackjack Pizza and asked for an advance on their salary, their hours already worked for the prom weekend, and they were both given this money. Now, let's talk about some, before we get back into what happened during this timeline, let's get into kind of the logistics around the school. Think about a lunch period. A lunch period. What I mean by that is letter A, lunch, because a lot of this focused around the A lunch period. You had the majority of the students that wanted to eat early would go to lunch during A lunch period. The principal of the school had ordered 4 cameras set up in the commons and the cafeteria to kind of video what was going on. The principal was always present during A lunch period. He liked to walk around and speak to the students. And Frank DeAngelis was a good principal. He loved to hang out with the students. The students loved to come up and speak with him, and he always made sure he was in the cafeteria during that beginning or the A lunch period. Each day, one of the custodians of the school would come in just before the lunch period. They would remove the old tape, put the new tape in so that they would always have a view of what went on in the cafeteria in case something happened. However, Columbine was an open lunch period, or lunch school campus, which means children with cars. And as I said, this was now trending to be a very rich area. Most of the students had their own transportation, and a lot of the juniors and seniors would leave for lunch. So you had generally a lot of activity, and everybody would walk through the cafeteria because it was just the thing to do to even go out to the junior and senior parking lots, which were on either side of that cafeteria entrance, to get into their cars to go get lunch. So a lunch period was the perfect time if you wanted to do something as insane as top the kill counts of both Timothy McVeigh and the Branch Davidians. And that's what Eric Harris wanted to do. He had chosen specifically April 19th, 1999, which was the anniversary of the Branch Davidian Waco incident, where up to that point it was one of the largest mass suicides, mass killings in the history of the United States. So he chose the date of his massacre for the anniversary of that mass suicide, or massacre, whatever your opinion on it is. But he wanted to top both that and the destruction that Timothy McVeigh wreaked when he bombed the federal building in Oklahoma City. He wanted to kill more than McVeigh and the Branch Davidians put together. And he centered his plan around that beginning lunch period. And this was the plan. From the Anarchist Cookbook, Dylan and Eric had constructed a lot of propane bombs using aerosol can triggers and old-fashioned alarm clocks for their triggers. They had also gathered up a huge amount of gasoline in gallon jugs, and their plan was essentially to kill as many people as possible and then to die in the subsequent firefight. They would first go early the morning of the 19th, and they would take one of the propane bombs to a park near Eric Harris's house and allow it to go off about 11 a.m. to cause a diversion and get police over there. Then, by the time the A lunch period began, about 11:13, that is when the majority of the students that were either going through the cafeteria to get to their cars or there to eat would be there. Approximately 400 to 600 students would be in that area, or in that general area. After putting the decoy in the nearby park, they would go to the school, driving in their own separate cars, Eric's Honda Prelude and Dylan's vintage rehabbed BMW. They would park one in the senior parking lot and one in the junior parking lot on either side of the entrance. They would then go carrying about 12 of the propane bombs into the cafeteria. They would set them under 2 load-bearing columns that basically held up the second floor, and above the cafeteria was the new library. So their plan was to set those to go off at approximately 11:13. When that happened, it would blow the columns. The fireball would kill hundreds of people in the cafeteria. The columns would collapse, and the second floor would also collapse, killing anybody that was in the library and finishing off any survivors down below. By this time, Eric and Dylan would have taken up a position at their cars, one on either side of the entrance, and as survivors started to run out, they would start shooting at them with the Tech 9s and the shotguns. And they fully anticipated killing at least another 50 to 100 people during this before police and school security were able to get them. They both anticipated dying during the fire exchange. Then, because they wanted to still kill more people, they also planted several of the propane bombs in their cars right next to 1-gallon jugs of gasoline. When the bombs went off, they would explode, take their cars out, and take out hundreds of people, probably in the parking lot, students, teachers, staff, first responders, media, whoever happened to be there. They would take them out as well. So they were hoping for casualty count well into the hundreds, therefore topping both the Branch Davidians and Timothy McVeigh. So the weeks before the incident, they spent a lot of their own lunch periods buying up ammo. They had a goal of having at least 800 rounds of ammo, and they were hoping to have that before the 19th, which they had planned for their massacre. But first was prom, which was scheduled for April 17th, 1999 at the Denver Design Center in downtown Denver. Dylan was planning to go with a group of 5 couples. He and Robin were going with this group in a limo. They first went to the Bella Restaurant, which is a very fancy Italian restaurant in Denver. They went there. Eric had a huge salad, some pasta, a dessert. He then went outside and chatted with one of his friends while smoking a cigarette and talked about how excited he was to go to Arizona the next year, become a computer engineer, and start his life. He was talking and laughing as if that would happen when he knew that he would be dead, supposedly, by Tuesday morning. So, very different, just very weird. That's the only thing I can say, just very weird. Dylan and his crew went on to the prom and had a very fine evening. He even danced with Robin to a couple of slow songs, had a great time. And then they all went off to the after party, which was taking place all the way back in Columbine at the gym, which had been turned into a New York casino night. There was a lot of cutouts of the Statue of Liberty, the Empire State Building, and they basically turned it into a New York-style casino with fake money, of course. Eric, on the meantime, called Susan about 7 p.m. that Saturday of the prom and invited her over. Instead of taking her to the prom, they just hung out in his basement room. They watched a German slasher film about a spaceship that comes back from hell. Event Horizon was the name. They actually listened to some German heavy metal music, which Eric was very fond of, and that doesn't really surprise me. Not all German heavy metal, but a lot of the German heavy metal falls into, a lot of white supremacists listen to it. There's a lot of German underground slasher metal that has a lot of racist overtones, and he was a fan of that type of music. I don't think Susan really knew what it was, but she said she had a very lovely evening chatting with them. They did kiss before he left. They even spent some time chatting with her parents. She left about 11 and went home. Eric got up and went over to the high school and joined Dylan and his friends at the after party and spent the evening partying away. They then slept most of the day on Sunday. However, waking up on Monday morning, the original planned date of what they were going to do, they realized they didn't have enough ammo, that he did not have the amount of ammo that he wanted for his plan. So he said, we can't do this today, it'll have to be tomorrow. Therefore, changing the date from April 19th, 1999 to April 20th, 1999, incidentally was Adolf Hitler's birthday, and Eric made note of that. So it makes me wonder if that was planned or he changed his mind because it was Adolf. So you went from the anniversary of the Branch Davidian incident at Waco to Adolf Hitler's birthday. The story gets more and more evil, I swear. So they contacted Mark Maines, who helped them get the final 100 rounds of ammo. And they woke up Tuesday, April 20th, ready to go about 5 a.m. This is going to be kind of a rough one to get through, so I hope you understand. I am going to address as many of the individual students as I can. I will address each and every one of those that were killed. I may not get all of those that were wounded, though. There was quite a few wounded at different times, so I may not be able to touch on all of them, but I will touch on as many as I can. I may have to stop the video. I've teared up a couple of times just writing my research, so please understand that I will have to pause if I get a little verklempt, which I'm a softie, so that happens. Also, after we finish talking about the actual killings and massacre, I will get into the aftermath and the theories around it and what happened as far as the lawsuits and the punishments afterwards. So let's get into it, shall we? They woke up at 5 a.m., April 20th, Eric and Dylan. They got up as if they were going to their normal 6 a.m. bowling class. Dylan left his home about 5:30 in the morning, shouting out to Susan and Thomas, who were still asleep, simply saying bye. He went to go meet up with Eric, and they skipped all their morning classes because they still had some preparation to do. Across town, Coach Dave Sanders was in a rush to get to the school because he was running late for an early morning practice. Normally, he would kiss his second wife, Linda Lou, goodbye, but that morning both of them were so hurried they didn't have the chance, and they simply shouted a goodbye to each other from their respective cars and took off. Dylan met up with Eric at the grocery store to get more propane tanks to finish out the remainder of the propane bombs they intended to make. They met at Eric's house after getting what they needed. Eric got the propane, Dylan got gas. Eric wrote "Make Today Count" on Dylan's diary to remind his somewhat timid friend to stay the course, and they ended up leaving 6 bombs at Dylan's because they didn't think they needed them, and left 2 of the bombs at Eric's in the closets of their respective rooms. Both of them were wearing black cargo pants. Dylan wore his typical red sock cap backwards, and Eric had a t-shirt that said "Natural Selection" on, with black combat boots as well, and they each split a pair of black gloves, one of them wearing the right one of them wearing the left one. At 11 a.m., they arrived at the park near Eric Harris's house, and they set 1 propane bomb near a tree to set off the diversionary explosion. They set that timer for 11:14. Then they jumped into their cars and headed for the school to plant the cafeteria bombs. They needed to have already been at the school, so they were already running late, probably because they were still preparing for it that morning. At about 11:10, they pulled up at the school. Dylan parked in his normal parking spot in the senior parking lot. Eric pulled into the junior parking lot. While pulling in, Eric got waves from some of the girls, and he waved back at them like nothing was going to happen. One of Eric's friends confronted him in the junior parking lot, both about parking in the wrong spot and also because he had missed a psych exam in their psych class earlier today. Eric said, "Doesn't matter. I love you, man. Go home." just like that. And the boy said he got an eerie feeling, but he went ahead and crossed over to got to his car and headed for his house for lunch. They basically had about 3 minutes to get into the cafeteria and leave the duffel bags with the bombs and get the timer set. They entered the cafeteria. They left the duffel bags, which had already been set to go off about 11:17, underneath the 2 load-bearing columns, and they headed back out to their cars to set the timers on those bombs and prepare to shoot the survivors running out the building. So it was kind of, now they were waiting. Meanwhile, the school custodian on duty pulled his normal ladder up to change the tapes in the video cameras, but instead of putting in a fresh tape, he was going to reuse an old one, and so he popped it in and hit rewind, and also took a phone call. So because of that, 8 minutes of the whole exchange was missed. By the time the camera flashed back on, Eric and Dylan had already left the cafeteria. If the janitor had actually replaced it with a fresh tape, started recording immediately and not taken his phone call, most likely the video in the cafeteria would have caught the boys leaving the duffel bags in the cafeteria. But because of, 1, rewinding a used tape, and 2, the custodian taking a phone call, neither of these are like bad things, but it just happened to be the wrong thing to happen at the wrong time, if that makes sense. We would have gotten the full story on video. Principal Frank was already in the cafeteria doing his normal rounds as the students started to filter in, as well as Coach Dave Sanders was in the cafeteria that day, chatting it up with students as well. Time went on. Both the boys out at their car looked at their watches, because people still were watches. Remember, this is the 90s. And noticed that the bomb should have long ago gone off. They did not, because they were lousy bomb makers, and thank goodness for it. The bombs did not go off, and students started filtering in and out of the cafeteria as they normally would. People that were going home for lunch went out towards their cars. Normal day at school. People that were eating in the cafeteria got their food and sat down. Normal day. By this time, Eric realizes if they're going to make anything happen today, they've got to just start shooting. So he runs quickly over to Dylan, who is just standing at his car like a beta, waiting for direction. They both started running toward the school. The first student they met was 18-year-old Rachel Scott. They started firing at both her and her boyfriend, Richard Castaldo, and both of them went down. Now, Rachel, you may know from, she's had several movies made about her. She's the one that is rumored to have been asked by Eric Harris if she believed in God, and when she said yes, he says, well, go be with him then, and shot her in the head. There is absolutely no proof that ever happened. Richard is still alive. He is permanently paralyzed as a result of being hit in the spine. But all he said happened once Rachel was shot. He knew she was in bad shape. He asked her if she was all right. She moaned and then died. So, still a sad end. But if you enjoy Christian movies, evangelical Christian movies, there's some great ones about Rachel Scott. All you have to do is Google them. And those were the first 2 victims. From there, both boys ran toward the second floor staircase and kind of went up to the end of the hallway where the library was. And from there, Eric started firing at random. Still, people weren't running. They weren't panicking. They honestly thought this might have been a video production class project, or maybe it was paintball, because no one ever believed this could ever happen at Columbine. And it was 3 boys that actually thought it was just Eric clowning around with a paintball, and they actually ran toward him. Daniel Rohrbach, Sean Graves, and Lance Kirkland actually started going up the same staircase that Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold were on. Eric shot all 3 of them. Daniel was killed instantly, shots to the chest and the neck region. Sean was shot in the back. He said he could no longer feel his legs. And Lance Clerkin was also shot in the torso region. Lance fell down and stayed down. He passed out for a bit, and so he thought that more time had passed than actually was, but actually just a few seconds had passed when he came to. He saw somebody standing over him. He said he reached up and grabbed the person's pants leg and asked for help. And unfortunately, it was Dylan Klebold, and Dylan said, "Sure, I'll help you," and shot him again, point blank. He would go on to survive. Sean was seen by a custodian who grabbed him and drug him toward the bottom entrance to the school, to the cafeteria, but was shot at by Eric Harris, so he had to jump away. He yelled to Sean, who was now laying in the doorway of the cafeteria between the door and the entrance. He whispered to him, "Play dead, play dead." And Sean did. He said he couldn't feel his legs. He thought he was dying. So he just kind of put himself into a trance and laid there. Meanwhile, inside the cafeteria, the principal and Coach Dave Sanders, as well as two custodians, John Curtis and Jay Galantine, started telling the students to hide underneath the tables in the cafeteria. And once they realized that the shooters were outside, not inside, they started directing them to the second floor via the second floor staircase and telling them to go out other entrances or hide in classrooms. Because they knew the shooters were just outside on the junior parking lot side, they started directing students to the east side up those stairs and out the school that way, as well as Coach Sanders started running down the hallway, telling the teachers in their classrooms to lock their doors and to put their students under their desk. He also shoved a few students that didn't really know what was going on, because you got to remember it's a big school. So they were hearing the gunfire, but to them it just sounded like BBs or something light crackling. They couldn't really tell it was gunfire. So they were kind of confused, and so Coach Sanders pushed a great deal of students into classrooms and locked them in. You also had the principal and the janitors or the custodians directing students still in the cafeteria back into the kitchens to hide in the freezers and the refrigerators in the large storage rooms. You still had students hiding under tables that were afraid to come out. The video cameras from this time showed pretty much a deserted cafeteria. Even though there were still people in there under tables, it looked pretty much deserted. It was at this time that Dylan came into the cafeteria, stepping over Sean, who was still in the doorway, pretending to be dead, and as he passed over him, Sean said he heard him say, "Sorry, dude," and stepped over him, going in to kind of check the bombs. When he realized that they were not going to go off, he went back outside and got Eric, who was outside still shooting and now pelting pipe bombs. They had pipe bombs strapped to themselves. They were now throwing pipe bombs down into the grass, and they were exploding all around. It was at this time that Eric sees 17-year-old Anne-Marie Hochhalter, who is trying to run for her life. He fires, hitting her in the back, instantly paralyzing her from the waist down. It was also about this time that the first law enforcement responded in the way of Deputy Gardner, who was actually a posted guard at the school. He had left the school to go get a Subway sandwich that morning. Again, I'm not judging any of these people. They were just doing normal daily activities. Actually returned to the school and started exchanging fire with Eric from one of the parking lots. He also then heard the first 911 call come in from a student that was outside on his radio, saying that a female had been shot. They did not know if she was dead, referring to Rachel Scott. Art teacher Patty Nielsen had been in the library, and she came into the hallway when she heard what sounded like gunshots to her, and she saw through two sets of glass doors somebody outside the stairwell potentially firing. She honestly thought it was a video production project as well, but she decided she was going to deal with it. So her and a student who was trailing behind her went down the hallway through the two sets of doors, almost to the end of the door, when she realized it indeed was not just a project. And by that time, Eric turned the gun on her and the junior student. They both turned and ran back through the first glass door towards the second. It was at that point that both of them said they felt searing hot pain into their shoulder. They had been hit by shrapnel. They weren't actually hit by the bullet, but they were hit by the glass exploding when the bullet hit it. They both stumbled into the library, and it was there that Patty Nielsen said she picked up the phone. She was very meticulous. She said she could not waste any time. She hit 9 to get out of the school and dialed 911, and it is her very famous 911 call that I'm going to play for you now.
Jefferson County 911. Yes, I am a teacher at Columbine High School. There is a student here with a gun. He has shot out a window. I believe one I've been Columbine High School. I don't know what's in my shoulder. If it was just a last beat through it. Okay, has anybody been injured, ma'am? Yes. Okay. Yes. And the school is in a panic, and I'm in the library. I've got students down under the table, kids. Heads under the table. Kids are screaming. Some of the teachers are, trying to take control of things. We need police here. Okay, we're getting them there.
Aaron went back outside after stepping in to deal with Patty Nielsen and continued to fire at Deputy Gardner. Eric's rifle jammed, so he stopped to get that unjammed, and then both he and Dylan ran into the school. Coach Sanders is still running up and down the halls trying to get students into classrooms when he encounters Dylan and Eric. Dylan shoots him as he tries to run away. He runs away at the same time. Principal Frank is coming up from another direction, and the principal turns and runs. Coach Sanders turns to try to go away, and Dylan shoots him twice in the back. He still stumbles down the hallway. He heard something thrown behind him. Turned out to be a pipe bomb that Dylan had thrown that exploded in the hallway. The coach fell down in front of Science Lab 3, and both the student and the lab teacher pulled him in to the lab and locked the door, and then tried to deal with his wounds. He was bleeding profusely. They started using blankets, gauze, whatever they had in the lab to staunch the flow of blood. They made a couple of 911 calls telling them they had someone bleeding to death. They needed help. One of the students made a poster board that said "1 bleeding to death" and hung it outside one of the windows so that hopefully someone would see it and rescuers would come in. No one was coming for a long time, and the 911 dispatchers kept telling them, someone will be there soon, someone will be there soon, all the time. A hero, Coach Sanders, is laying on the floor bleeding out. Meanwhile, Eric and Dylan run into the cafeteria, and this is where you see the famous surveillance camera shot of them in the cafeteria. They go up to check the bombs. They fire off a few rounds at the bombs, trying to get them to detonate. They still did not go off. During this process, other deputies, Jefferson County Sheriff's deputies, have arrived on scene. Eric exchanged fire through a window with a couple of them, but then they raced upstairs toward the library. And there was just generally a lot of confusion on campus now, with first responders starting to get there. No one knew how many shooters, where they were. Both the boys took off their trench coats. Dylan's in the library. Eric's just as he stepped inside the school. And then you also had a contracted painter on the roof that was seen by people, thought he might be one of the shooters. So you had the illusion of more than 2 shooters. So there was a lot of confusion. And it was during this time that Dylan and Eric entered the library. And in the library, there was a lot more students there because it had been prom weekend. A lot of homework didn't get done. A lot of studying didn't get done. So there were a lot of students in there cramming. There were 40 students in there hiding under tables and closets, as well as Patty Nielsen and the librarians. And this is where they entered the library. And probably one of the more tragic time periods of the massacre began. Let's talk about that. All right, before I go into what happened in the library, just wanted to kind of show you the outside of the school here. Here is the front entrance, known as the Commons, with bike racks and places where people would eat lunch. Here's another view of it, and then here is the stair location showing the different levels of the school. The cafeteria was here on the first level. You can't really see the entrance. And then up here was the entrance to the library where Eric was shooting from. So this is just to kind of give you a view of that. Here is a picture of Rachel Scott. She was 17, not 18. My apologies. She was the first to die outside. As I said, she is the subject of several different faith-based movies and books. Daniel Rohrbough, 15, he was the second to die. He was the one that thought it was a paintball. He was heading out to a nearby park to eat lunch with his two friends, Lance and Sean. His mother would later say that she had actually had a very long conversation with him that morning, which was unusual. He was shot several times, and he laid outside for 24 hours. We will go over that as well. Coach Dave Sanders, he was the one that was trying to evacuate students and help students hide. He was technically the third to die in the massacre. He was credited with helping over 100 students to die, as well as the principal credits him with saving his life as well, because he took the bullet that could have just as easily been for the principal, he said. He would later bleed to death in Science Lab 3. His last words were to the other teacher in the room, "Tell my family I love them." Here is the moment where you should see both killers, the famous footage from the cafeteria, where they had re-entered the cafeteria to try to detonate the bombs. As you can see, it's about 11:57 a.m. The whole thing would be over by 12:08. Both killers would be dead, as well as 10 students and 1 teacher. As you can see, it looks deserted because all the students have hidden. They have, as you said, both taken off their jackets, so that created confusion about exactly how many killers or shooters there were. This is the library right after it was cleared. You can see the tumult as the killers entered the library with 40 students, librarian and Patty Nielsen, the art teacher, hiding inside. They start going from table to table looking for students. A lot of the students had hidden under tables. The next to die, he was the first student killed in the library. The fourth overall, he was a stroke survivor. Kyle Beliquez, age 16, he was a stroke survivor. He was special needs. He only attended high school for the morning, so he was about to leave to go home. If this had happened at any other time, he probably would not have been there. He was shot in the face and died instantly. Next to die was the youngest person killed in the massacre, Stephen Kurnow, age 14. He was a Star Wars fan, and he was the second to die in the library when the shooter shot underneath the table he was hiding in under. Cassie Bernal, she was starting over. She had had a problem with drugs and other things in her past and was recovering. She had made a great turnaround. She was a role model for her younger sister. Her mom said that she had turned into one of the greatest girls she had ever known. And she was hiding under a library table with some other girls when Eric Harris leaned under and said peekaboo and shot her in the face. She rolled out and was laying kind of in the walkway rather than under the table. Isaiah Scholes, age 18, one of the few African-American students at the school. He wanted to be a stand-up comedian. He had a heart defect as a child and overcame it to both wrestle and play football. He was hiding with 2 of his friends, studying with 2 of his friends in the library, and hid under the table with them. He was very popular with the students. Both of the killers, and I say killers because they are, both of the killers targeted him, yelling racial slurs at him before they shot him dead. He was the fourth to die in the library. Matthew Ketchner, 16, was studying with Isaiah and their friend Craig Scott. He also played football and lifted weights. He was also shot by Dylan and Eric and died next to his friend Isaiah. Craig Scott, their third friend, was wounded but played dead and laid in the blood of his 2 dead friends. Laura Townsend was 18. She was hiding under tables with some friends. She comforted her friend Val Schnur, who she held her hand during the entire ordeal, whispering, "It's going to be okay, going to be okay." Val did live, but she was shot Lauren was shot about 5 times and died holding her friend's hand. She played volleyball and was a straight A student. John Tomlin, age 17, he helped hide his friend, Nicole Nolan, who was kind of froze. He drug her under a table. He held her hand until he was shot twice and died. Nicole was shot in the stomach, but she would survive. Just the courage of these children is just amazing. Kelly Fleming, age 16, she loved to write poetry, which is what she was doing in the library that morning. She was a newbie in to the school, so she didn't have a whole lot of friends. She tried to hide, but because there were so many other students under the table, she was kind of partially visible, and they shot her in the back. She fell halfway into the walkway, halfway under the table. Daniel Mauser, he was underneath the computer table. He attempted to trip Dylan by pushing a chair in front of him, hoping that he would fall and drop the gun and maybe he could get it. Ironically, he was a gun control advocate. He had discussed it with his father. They had gone to some rallies. He really believed that guns were too easy to get, and ironically, he was hoping to trip Dylan so that he could get a hold of the gun. Dylan, of course, the chair missed Dylan. Dylan looked at him and said, "Nice glasses," and shot him in the face. Corey DePuter was shot next. 17, just all-American kid, straight-A students, loved to read fantasy books. He was shot underneath the table where he was hiding. And finally, reaching the end of the students they thought were in the library, Eric and Dylan came to the southwest end of the library behind some shelves of books, and they both put a bullet in their head, therefore ending the Columbine Massacre at 12:08 p.m., April 20th, 1999. And once the shooters were dead, chaos reigned on the campus. You still had the full force of the Jefferson County Sheriffs, led by Sheriff John Stone, who were there. They had set up a tactical area just about a half mile from the school. Any students that came out were immediately evacuated to both nearby homes and community centers and the public library. The public library and the community center, where the students were, put up a sign-up sheet for students to sign their names and print their names so that they would know who was there. Around noon, this is 8 minutes before the 2 shooters committed suicide, you finally had officers start to storm the school from the east side and started searching door to door, blasting open doors, and helping the terrified students and teachers out of the building. Another team came in from the west doing the same thing, started to rescue the wounded both inside and out. Before he had journeyed into the library to meet his own death, Eric had fired at a few of them. However, he did not hit any of them. And then finally you had SWAT enter the cafeteria and stormed from the west as well. They liberated the people hiding in the cafeteria storage areas. It was now that rumors started to abide. And no one really knew what was going on, but you had the rumor mill starting. You had the media getting involved. You had the students calling the media. You even had somebody that was hiding in the school under his desk talking on air with an anchor. You had students calling other reporters. You had students calling each other, and they all had their suspicions about who did this. And 2 names came up, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. Dylan's good friend, Nate, actually called Dylan's house asking, because he hadn't seen him in school that day, he wanted to ask if he was there. Tom and Susan, who both happened to be home, said no, he wasn't there, and Nate tearfully asked if they could please see if his trench coat was there. Terrified Tom went into Dylan's room, looked in his closet, looked all over his room, could not find the trench coat, and he said at that point he knew that his son was involved in this, and he called the police and he called a lawyer. Meanwhile, while the police are trying to liberate the school, you still have science lab number 3 on the 2nd floor with that one bleeding to death sign in the window, desperately calling for help. By the time the police actually got there and took him away, he died en route to the hospital. Many of the students who were hiding in classrooms, like I said, it was a huge school, so they didn't really hear the shots anymore. They were watching what was happening on the school's CCTV system. And those are the ones that started to make calls to the local press. Meanwhile, you had FBI agent and criminal psychologist Dr. Dwayne Fusela arrive on scene. Dr. Fusela was, ironically, had been involved in the Branch Davidian storming of the Waco Branch Davidian incident. He was the last person to talk to David Koresh on the phone before they set fire to their compound. He was a brilliant hostage negotiator and just negotiator in general, and he came to the school because his son Brian went to school there. He was more looking for his son than anything, but also decided to offer his services to see what he could do, because he was not only a well-known FBI agent that came from the Denver office, but he was also someone that had instructed some of the SWAT members on hostage negotiation as well. So he teamed up with some of those officers and tried to make head or tails of what was going on. Again, a lot of misinformation coming out because you have students watching CCTV, you have reporters all around the area, you have police on 3 sides of the school not really talking with each other. You had Jefferson County not really communicating with the Littleton police force, who had actually finally got there, because this was still an unincorporated area. It was just the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department mostly. You did finally have some Littleton police officers come in, and now Agent Fusela with the FBI there as well. So still a lot of misinformation. The massacre had started around 11:17 a.m. and ended at 12:08, but it wasn't until 1:30 to 2 p.m. that wounded people started flooding into hospitals. So it took a while to clear the space. Due to them interrogating kids that were at the library asking what they knew, they started arresting some of Dylan and Eric's friends, and because some of their friends knew they were making pipe bombs. They had no idea what they were making them for, but they knew they were making pipe bombs, and they confessed to it. They also said that Robin knew Dylan real well, had went to the prom with him the previous evening, or the previous weekend, and they took her in for questioning. She was nervous, she was scared, she did not know what to do, so she just kept quiet about helping them get the guns, because she didn't want to go to jail. I mean, she was a scared kid. Also, it was about 1 p.m. you had young Patrick Ireland, who was also shot in the library. I didn't talk about him because he did not die, thank goodness, but he actually woke up he was shot several times in the head. He actually woke up and drug himself a few feet from the table that he was under to the window, opened the window, and kind of flung himself out. He was hanging kind of halfway down the window, and there is a famous picture, which I will insert him, of police helping him get out of the window. This is before the building was entirely cleared, but they hadn't gotten to the library yet. They were in the building, and they helped him get to safety. He recovered almost fully. He has a little bit of, he said, slow mental acuity sometimes, but he made it. Brave young man. So there was still a lot of chaos, even as chaos. I know.
Still reeling from this, just stunned at the numbers that came out all day long. An awful lot of people thought that there were only perhaps going to be a few fatalities out of this, and as terrible as that would be, to hear that there are 25 fatalities is just stunning to people. That may include some teachers, from what people have said. The chaos down there is impossible to overstate, Peter. This afternoon, students were going everywhere to gunmen or more. So
I say that a lot, but it's absolutely true. This was one of the most chaotic. Even by the time President Clinton spoke, we still didn't know everything.
I've asked the Attorney General and the Secretary of Education to stand ready to assist local law enforcement, the schools, the families, the entire community during this time of crisis and sorrow. A crisis response team is ready now to travel to Colorado, and I strongly believe that we should do whatever we can to get enough counselors to the families and the children as quickly as possible. I know the other communities that have been through this are also ready to do whatever they can to help. I think that Patricia Holloway would not mind if I said that amidst all the turmoil and grief that she and others are experiencing, she said to me just a moment ago that perhaps now America would wake up to the dimensions of this challenge if it could happen in a place like Littleton, and we could prevent anything like this from happening again.
So by this time they had gotten through the entire, after the president spoke, they had finally gotten through the entire school. They had found all of the bodies and were starting to identify them. They started to gather the parents of the deceased at a local library to kind of break the bad news. All the time, Sheriff Stone was telling the parents that there was a late bus coming of children. Children were starting to be, kind of reunited with their parents, and so these parents honestly thought they were there to pick up their children, and they were told a bus was coming by Sheriff Stone. A bus wasn't coming. They were informed that their children had passed away. Many of the parents broke down immediately, but of course, as you can imagine, but one of them would later recant that the difference between the Catholics and the mainline Protestants versus the evangelicals, the evangelicals, even though they were breaking down on the inside, still managed to comfort others more than themselves. So they said in that moment they were actually practicing what they preached, and they took it upon themselves to comfort others, with special attention being given to Isaiah's parents because he was one of the very few African-American students at the school. During all of this investigation, because they had been questioning their friends and gotten their names, police went to both Dylan and Eric's homes. The Harrises were very uncooperative. They demanded warrants if they wanted to search. Finally, they got those warrants. They went down to the basement where they found all of the journals, all the timelines, all the planning materials. They found the hidden propane bombs in the closet. They found the basement tapes, everything they need to know about what happened. The Harrises have never really talked to the press. They keep things very private, so not a whole lot said. Eric's older brother Kevin he was a football star at Columbine, had actually already gone on to the University of Colorado, so he wasn't there. But they did search the house. Now the Klebolds, even though they called their lawyer, they did cooperate with the police. They allowed the police to search, and they found the bombs hidden in Dylan's room as well as all of Dylan's journals and writings and things like that. And they slowly started to piece some of this together. It took well over 48 hours to clear the school of everything. During some of the searches, some of the bombs did go off. One of them was the decoy bomb over in the park near Eric's house. It did go off and start a small grass fire that was easily taken care of. Some of the bombs planted in the school did pop off while they were being removed. No one was hurt, thank goodness. Probably the worst part of this is that the students laying on the grass outside the school, those bodies laid there for over 24 hours, about 28 hours. Those bodies laid there. So that was Daniel and that was Rachel, laid out there for the longest time. Rachel might have been removed a little sooner than Daniel, but they were still left to lie out there. So you had a lot of angry parents at how the bodies of their children were treated, and I can't say I blame them.
Joining us now from outside the scene of today's tragedy, John Stone, the Jefferson County Sheriff. Rough day, huh, Sheriff?
Rough day. Sad day for Colorado.
A sad day for the country. What is it that you can tell us about the situation inside that building now? Because I gather you still haven't been able to remove the bodies.
That's correct. We have an unsafe situation due to the amount of bombs we found in the school. We removed 12 of them out of there so far. We're running into booby traps at different locations due to the late hour here right now, and we're going to secure the site for the night. We can't even go in remove bodies or do any of that identification because of the massive amount of ordnance that we run into in the building. It makes it an unsafe situation right now.
When you talk about bombs, what are you talking about? Pipe bombs or grenades?
I haven't seen any of the devices yet, but a lot of them are handmade devices, and but we've exploded several of them. We found them both outside in the parking lot of the school, outside of the school area, and so far a dozen of them in the school.
So we have the aftermath. We have a country and a community trying to figure out what happened and why this happened. You had lawyers being hired on all sides. You had lawsuits being filed against the Klebolds, against the Harrises, against the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department about how they handled the investigation and especially the removal of the student bodies. You had lawsuits filed against the school system. You had everybody suing everybody, and all the time trying to find out why this happened. Of course, highly evangelical area, the evangelicals immediately blamed Satan. Satan was behind this. It was Satanism. It was Satan walking among them. You had those fire and brimstone services coming out at the local evangelical churches. The mainstream and the Catholics had a very different take on it, but you had Satan as the main thing. You also had them being accused of being part of the trench coat mafia, which was a group of boys that did hang around with trench coats and were computer geeks and gaming geeks and played Dungeons and Dragons and didn't really like jocks too much. But Dylan and Eric were never seen in any of their pictures. They weren't friends with any of the boys. Those men now have been interviewed and said they didn't really know Eric. They didn't really know Dylan. Dylan and Eric were not part of their group. And they only used their trench coats maybe to put the blame off on them, but they were not part of the trench coat mafia, and it was not a plan to shoot jocks. It was a plan to commit suicide and take as many people out as you could. Then, of course, you had gun control issues that came out of this. It was too easy for them to get guns. It was, there's also the argument that maybe more armed security guards there would have helped. You had the one armed security guard that was not on post. He did return fire, exchange fire with Eric Harris. Didn't really hit him, but he did keep Eric Harris occupied. Maybe if there had been more armed security there, they A, wouldn't have tried it, or B, they would have kept them pinned down so that this many students wouldn't have died. Who knows? I'm a big believer in Second Amendment, but I think there needs to be some regulations about who gets guns. I mean, I really do. If we would just I think gun shows should go. I'm going to say that gun shows should go. And private sales, you should still have to do background checks and things like that. That's as political as I'm going to get. And then, violent video games and violent movies was another reason put out there why this happened. Both of the boys were into video games and into violent movies and music. Do I think those things make you violent? No. If you already have violent tendencies, which it's obvious that Eric did, that the music he was listening to was charging him up. Maybe the video games charged him up a little bit, but they didn't cause it. They're not a cause. I've watched slasher movies my entire life. I've never hurt anyone, and don't plan to. So I think that's just a convenient excuse. Finally, mental health. And I think mental health is probably the majority of the reason why a lot of bad things happen. We let mental health go untreated for the most part in this country, and that's a sad thing. I don't know what the solution is. I think better health care, more access to health care. Definitely, I think we still need to have state-run mental hospitals where people can get the help that they need. If either of these boys had been there and gotten the help they needed, this wouldn't have happened. Dr. Fuselier was the main one that led the investigation of the basement tapes and all the writings and everything that Dylan and Eric left. And he basically said it best. You had a homicidal psychopath meeting a depressed man with suicidal tendencies, and this is what happens.
Dylan I saw as primarily suicidal. hooking up with Eric Harris. So you had anger and homicidality on one side, and depression and suicidality and emotion on the other side coming together and led to a fatal friendship.
So I'm going to vote for a lot of things, but mental health is one of the main ones. And the legal aftermath, Mark Maines and Philip Duran, who helped them get both the Tech 9s and the shotguns. Mark Maines was sentenced to 6 to 9 years for selling the guns, and Philip Duran was sentenced 4 to 5 years for introducing them and helping them get it. Lawsuits, all but one of the lawsuits against Jefferson County Sheriff's Department were dismissed except one. The lawsuit of Coach Dave Sanders' daughter, who said that they caused undue harm by not evacuating him properly and by continuously lying to the people in the lab with him that help would be there in a moment. And they were awarded in 2002 a little over $2 million. Jefferson County admitted no wrong, but they did settle with them. And Dylan Harris's family, Eric Harris's family has never really spoke to the authorities. They won't. They probably never will. Only a little bit of the basement tapes have been released, and Susan Klebold has been the only one to speak out and talk about it. You know, parents of mentally ill children that don't know they're mentally ill. She's been a huge advocate and has gone around and been very open about the things she did wrong as well as the things that she didn't understand, and can now look back, and if she can help educate other parents that may prevent this from happening again, that's what she wants to do.
Didn't you wonder why he wanted a trench coat? What was that about?
Well, I was the kind of kid who loved to look different. I mean, I was an art major.
She says she does notice something, that Dylan seems to be losing interest in good grades. He builds his own computer and spends more time alone in his room. And sometimes he's moody and irritable. But she now says, as she looks back over her life, she is making a big mistake. Her son is changing, but she writes off the changes as an adolescent phase.
Sometimes he would seem, distant or quiet. And I remember asking him, "Are you okay? Are you sure you're okay? You seem so tired." And he'd stand up and say, "I've got a lot of homework. I need to go to bed."
And you let it go.
And I let it go. And that's the difference. I would dig, if it were me today, I would dig and dig and dig. I mean, I had all those illusions that everything was okay.
And so that's where we'll end. Columbine. That was a rough one. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to support the channel and the podcast, all that's down below. Please like, comment, share, subscribe. Let me know what you think. Am I wrong about mental health being one of the major reasons? Let me know down below, the good and the bad. I can take it. I'll be back real soon with another true crime and another Reddit read. I hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, Keto Comment.